Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming today, and also thank you to Sue McCluskey, who is the first special representative for Australian agriculture, and also a cattle farmer at Yass. Sue, welcome, and thank you very much for speaking with the Australian Holistic Management Cooperative today. And I'll let you get on with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. It's wonderful to be here. It's always good to speak to a whole lot of different groups of people. So if you're able to put my presentation up and I'll be able to go through it. I'm going to go through a bit of the background about my role, where I've been recently, and then some of the global context around what we've been doing, and then, segue into what I see coming up, and then we'll have a chance for questions. So the next slide, please, Helen. So my role as Special Representative for Australian Agriculture is a unique role. There are only 2 countries in the world that have a role like mine. And the reason it's unique is that I'm a ministerial appointment, but I'm an industry voice. So I'm not employed by the department. I don't have a constituency. I'm very independent. So it means I speak on behalf of all of Australian agriculture, including fisheries and forestry. And I found it to be a really influential role because it helps to represent and advocate for Australian agriculture, not just globally, but I bring back and share what I'm hearing. I like to think of it as being the bridge between industry and government, and also the relationship building. And that's very much what I'm mindful of when I'm in country. I do have other roles that I bring to this. I sit on a number of other boards that actually complement this. And as Helen said, I'm also a beef cattle farmer near Yass in New South Wales. Thanks, Helen. So my recent learnings have been, largely last year. When I first came into this role, it was interesting. I was supposed to be focused mostly on technical work, engagement with WTO, OECD. We quickly realised that this role was going to be more valuable, being focused around advocating for Australian agriculture, particularly around sustainability. And of course, climate change was the key thing I saw last year. The link with food security, and the clean and green message that's coming from other countries is really powerful, and it's something we need to be very much aware of. When I was in COP in Dubai at the end of last year, the thing that really struck me was just that clear link between agriculture and food security, and the importance of agriculture as a solution to climate challenges. And I was a bit despondent when I came back to Australia, because I said, why does our government not get this strong link? And so I've been quite vocal about that. And it's particularly important because Australia has made a bid for COP31. And so we probably won't find out who gets that until the COP29 this year in Baku. But if we do get that, it will be important then to build towards that and see what the milestones that will be put into place. Thanks, Helen. A lot of my role, as I said, is about domestic engagement. And so the first half of this year, I focus very much on engaging domestically with our peak bodies, with our NGOs, with the RDCs, sharing what I was hearing last year, because I had a very busy last 6 months last year overseas, but really hearing what industry are doing here, because the most powerful thing I find in country is to be able to give live case studies of what different industry sectors are doing, particularly around sustainability, around climate, around soils, things like that. What was coming through very clearly is that we actually do not have enough of the data and measurement that we need to be doing. On the data exists in pockets, but we need to get a better picture across data nationally. Measurement, there's a whole plethora of different calculators, and we need to get consistency around that. I'd also been very strongly given the message that we've actually got to be telling our story to the broader community. We can't just keep talking to ourselves. So one of the pleasing things has been that now the corporates are reaching out and asking me to go and talk to them, and that's from the property sector, lawyers, banks, accountants. And that's really important, because quite often these are the intermediaries that can help provide the link between farmers on the ground and then what they need to do to engage around sustainability. Strong message coming back from them, though, was also around data and reporting. And while a lot of the agribusiness and other corporates and supply chain have a lot of data themselves, it tends to be a bit commercial in confidence. So we've got to find a way to tap into that. Engaging with the researchers, had the opportunity to go to UNE, look at what they're doing at Armidale around some of the great work there, the ANU's Agri-Food Innovation Institute, and then also look at some of CSIRO's work. Once again, it's important for me to know what the science is behind what I'm talking about. So seeing what happens on the ground is particularly important. And then I've also been engaging with the Ag and Land Sector Plan, which is one of the plans under the Net Zero pathways, and really around co-design, and I'll talk a bit more about that soon. And then, of course, the Climate Summit at Toowoomba, that really was about bringing industry and government and other players together in the room with the NGOs to be able to talk about how we actually can make this happen on the ground. Thanks, Helen. I have also done some international travel. I went to Europe in June. I actually spoke at a couple of conferences there. So once again, was my opportunity to talk about the great things we're doing here around sustainability, but also to learn what's happening on the ground there. There's a picture of me and Tony Marr, who's the CEO of the National Farmers Federation. We were there in the Netherlands. It's great to actually collaborate with other Australians when they're in country and attend things together. We actually went to this property in the Netherlands. This was a young farmer, he and his partner. He's 34. They're running a paddock to plate enterprise. He's passionate about farming. But because of the EU's farm to fork legislation and the way that they're looking at reducing emissions, they're using a very blunt instrument, and that's to reduce the cattle herd by between 30 and 50%. This farmer is not going to be able to continue farming. He's going to have to leave the Netherlands if he wants to continue farming cattle. He leases the land. The owner of the land has been offered a significant amount of money from the government. He offered more, and the government came in and offered more again. So that is what we're up against in terms of ideology and the prescriptive approaches that we really need to make sure don't come into play here. In July, I went to Canada, once again, looking at their sustainability measures, what they were doing around monitoring. I actually went to quite a large farm. Canada's, I regard as being quite like-minded. They, I don't never need to explain size of herd, size of country. But what I hadn't realised was most of Canada is actually very cold. And even the areas that farm, they can be in winter for 8 months of the year. They can be under meters of snow. This particular farm I went to gets down to minus 48 where he's calving, and I thought, well, I won't complain about minus 6 or 7. But what it means is their practices are quite different. He has to put straw out in his feedlot every day in winter just for bedding. He has to shed his cattle. Because of, I think, a combination of feeding, shedding, and the cold weather, methane is not their biggest issue. It's really about nitrogen. That's their biggest emissions issue. And that's because they have such a short growing window, they need to put on huge amounts of fertilizer. So it was very interesting learning just the difference that you see over in Canada, even though we think that we're very similar. Next week, I'll be heading to Thailand and Singapore, where I'll be speaking at a sustainability summit and also engaging with other people around sustainability. Then I'm heading to Europe. I'm really keen to learn about what the UK is doing on natural capital work, because that's where we really are heading, and they're quite advanced here. I'm speaking at the World Food Forum in Rome, and then also at an OECD event in Paris, and then, of course, COP29 in Azerbaijan in November. Thanks, Helen. So I don't need to tell you what the challenges are to global trading. We've seen it with COVID, climate change, and, of course, conflict. And that conflict, as we only are too well reminded every time we turn on the news, just continues. And that has significant impacts on supply chains, but also on food security. On the other hand, what we're seeing is, even though we've gone through, quite a number of decades of increased globalization, we're seeing increased protectionism now. So the need for countries to actually hunker down and say that we are going to actually just look after our own countries or our own bloc and be less concerned about free and open trade. So that really has a lot of implications. Ideology, as I mentioned, and that results in very prescriptive and high regulation in a number of countries that we actually trade with. Thanks, Helen. What this means, of course, is that there are a number of challenges, but of course, on the other side, we have real opportunities, and that is that increasing world demand is going to mean that when it comes to the need to produce food, that's just going to grow. And the real significant markets are actually going to be in our near neighbours. So the growth of the need for food in Asia is going to outstrip the rest of the world, particularly from China. But India is a really big growing market, as is Vietnam. And so our opportunity to continue to provide food to these countries is just going to grow. And of course, we're really well placed here in Australia to be able to look to supply this, as long as we can meet the trade and market access rules that they may put in place. Thanks, Helen. And one of those challenges really ends up being around sustainability. And while we've had a really brilliant reputation for being clean and green, that's being eroded. And it's being eroded because I think perhaps we got a bit complacent, but we've had other countries that have actually seen what we've been doing. We always knew New Zealand traded on this really good clean green reputation, but you know, Ireland is doing amazing things here. Ireland is very interesting because it's still part of the EU, and I'm talking about Southern Ireland here, but it's so close to the UK, and the UK, of course, has gone through Brexit. It almost sits on the fence, but it has really gone streets ahead in terms of its branding, its green image, and is doing great things. So we've really got to make sure that we continue to hold on to that reputation. The social license to operate is a really key driver in the EU. And I'm always gobsmacked when I go there because it's quite confronting. The NGOs are really powerful. They're really well funded. And they've almost captured the politicians in terms of influencing the EU legislation. So that's where we've got this ideology that is not backed by science and evidence, that has actually driven a lot of the farm to fork, which is the EU legislation that has implications for their farmers. But there is significant concern about the ability for that to influence our closer markets like Southeast Asia. So we're not going to be able to get away from the demand for sustainability credentials, and the need to be able to demonstrate this. And of course, that has flow-on effects for our domestic policy. Thanks, Helen. But it's not all bad, really. What we're seeing, and this is one thing I always say when I'm in countries, there's no one size fits all. And it's equally as important here in Australia as it is anywhere else. So the way I farm on my property here near Yass is quite different to the way my neighbour may farm, to the way any of you may farm, simply because production systems are different, climatic conditions are different, soil conditions are different. And so we've actually got to be able to adapt to what our conditions are to make sure that we can farm in the most sustainable way, but also the most productive and profitable way. Because there's one thing that we in Australia do tend to forget, and that is we're amongst the few agricultural industries in the world that are not subsidised. Many other farmers around other parts of the world, particularly the EU, America, the US, India, their farmers are subsidised. So we need to do it. We need to farm in a way that really isn't just sustainable, but is also resilient. But in the end, sustainability has to be outcomes focused. So we can't be prescriptive, because there can't be one way of doing it and one way only. There's got to be place-based solutions, which I'm sure you've all heard about, which make sure that we can embrace that diversity. And when I'm in markets where they do subsidise their farmers, my narrative tends to be not you shouldn't subsidise, but I say support for agriculture is important, and we want to see more support. But there are different ways to provide support. And have you thought about repurposing your support to get better sustainability outcomes? An example of this was when I was in Vietnam recently. The heavily subsidised use of chemicals means that they actually are quite indiscriminate about how they use chemicals. So I had a conversation with their government officials around some of the impacts that may have on the health outcomes, particularly for children, and keep the money in the support, but rather than just provide it all to the chemical companies, maybe help farmers, help to invest in capacity building, teaching them how to do soil testing so that they're actually using their chemicals in a better way. And those are the sort of conversations that once you start it, you can continue to have. And then, of course, around the no one size fits all, that starts to bring our challenges around, well, how do we measure and report when there is so much diversity? Thanks, Helen. So what that means for us is that agriculture can and must be part of the solution. And this is something I bang on about all of the time. And, you know, the agriculture portfolio in Australia sits separate from our Department of Climate Change. And so I'm forever getting a bit frustrated as to why do they not get the importance of agriculture. And we can and must be part of the solution because there's already things that we do well. And in Australia, our farmers have been doing this well for decades. We've invested in soil health for a long time. Why? Because we've had really, really poor soils, some of the oldest and poorest soils in the world, and we've needed to do this. Canada has actually just developed a national soil strategy built on ours because they saw it as being the best in the world. We've had to do enormous things around water conservation, water use, simply because we're a very dry continent and we just don't get the rain. You know, when I was in Ireland, I was amazed, and something that struck me was I didn't see any dams. And when I mentioned this to someone, they just looked at me as if I was mad, and they say, why would we need dams? It rains all the time here. And so there's things like that that we've actually had to learn how to do in terms of conserving water and water use. That really goes to part of the solution around meeting the climate challenges and sustainability. We've been doing fantastic things around biodiversity and waste. I always like to talk about waste. We have a national waste policy. When you look at the contribution to GHG emissions, yes, methane is the major contributor, but then the next one's waste, and food waste in particular. And so this is the way I like to engage with the consumers around, don't just point the finger at farmers, actually consumers, there's a lot you can do to help with meeting climate challenges by actually being able to reduce some of your food waste. And then separately, of course, we've been doing a lot around carbon. We've now got our carbon credit units and markets, and we've been doing a lot for a long time around sequestration. And all of this goes towards demonstrating our circular food system. Thanks, Helen. So one of the great things we have done in Australia is develop the Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework. And look, whenever I put this up in global markets and talk to it, people are they just say, we would love to have something like this. In fact, Canada has actually asked Australia to partner with them to develop something similar. This, for me, is the overarching articulation of what Australian agriculture is doing around sustainability. There are 7 principles, and they align with ESG, so environmental social governance, which is the language of the corporates, but they also align with the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the language globally. So it speaks to any environment I'm in, but it actually says what we're doing and our commitments in relation to sustainability. Thanks, Helen. But also we have underpinning the overarching sustainability framework. Look, there's only a couple of examples I've put up here, but we have individual industry sector sustainability frameworks that are fit for purpose for that particular industry. And the beauty of this is those industry sectors can really focus on which are the particular principles that they need to prioritise for their industry sector. And even some of those industries that maybe have had to think carefully about how they've come on the journey, they're actually starting to be on the trajectory. So look, beef, sheep, grains, dairy went out early. Sugar's got a smart cane, best management practice framework. You know, they are slightly different, but everyone fits under that overarching Australian Agriculture Sustainability Framework. Horticulture's now on board, and I was really pleased to see what Hort's doing, particularly around waste, food waste, whole of crop use, what they're doing around people and resources, which of course fits under the S in terms of ESG. And they're doing great things there. And I spoke at the Seafood Conference last week in Hobart, and fisheries are now looking at starting to think about how they can develop their own sustainability framework. So that's great to see that we're able to do that here in Australia. But it embraces the diversity we have across so many different industry sectors that all can sit under an overarching framework. Thanks, Helen. The other piece of work that has been done here in Australia has been done by ABARES. And look, ABARES did this really good piece of research which looked at environmental sustainability and the indicators for that, and adjusted for the diversity of the environment. So that's saying no one size fits all, but also adjusted for the fact that we don't have subsidies. And what that work shows is that we have really strong sustainable credentials. When I can be in global markets and they'll say to me, but Australian farmers use a lot of pesticides and chemicals, I'll say, no, we don't. We don't. We actually use a whole range of different measures that actually, in the end, mean very sustainable practices. So we've been using no and low till for decades. You know, we use stubble retention. What this has all meant is we've been able to reduce our fertilizer use. We've been able to reduce our pesticides. We've been able to reduce our chemicals, but we haven't reduced them to zero. In Europe, they have this view that it must be zero pesticides and zero chemicals, but then they can be using heavy tillage or other practices that might not be sustainable for the land in the longer term. So that's really why I say we need to focus on outcomes rather than just what are our prescriptive practices. Thanks, Helen. So this is a piece of work I do refer to when I'm demonstrating sustainability. Then, of course, we've got our net zero by 2050. So this is part of the Paris commitment to reduce emissions to net zero by 2050. There are 6 sector plans under this. Agriculture is one of them, and so is LULUCF, which is land use change and forestry. You'll see waste is in there. Transport and electricity. Electricity has been where the low-hanging fruit has been and a lot of the focus has been. But, you know, I've been having some interesting conversations with Treasury where when I talked to them 6 months ago, it was no, the focus is on energy because that's where we've got to work on. And I've been saying, yeah, but the next biggest emitter is agriculture. We need to think about agriculture. And when I met with them quite recently, they said, you know what? Across all of those sectors, agriculture is the common theme. And I said, yes. Yes, it is. And that's why agriculture needs to be front and centre as part of the solution. But the really good thing about the work that's been done here, and we can learn from other countries, and I'm pleased that we have, is around co-design. And so the Department of Agriculture is going through a co-design process with industry at the moment, a huge amount of consultation to say, how will this work in practice? They've committed to not put in any hard targets for agriculture, but to say, how do we get everyone in the supply chain? How do we get farmers? How do we actually work out what the value proposition is before we actually come in with regulation? And I was part of a couple of workshops last week that actually was trying to work through this. So I think it's a great co-design process. Something that when I was in New Zealand recently, they didn't do and are now seeing a bit of a backlash with their farmers in how they're trying to know their number. Thanks, Helen. So, of course, when it comes to measuring emissions and looking at net zero, that's only one part of the story. I did talk about the fact that we've got a carbon market now in place. It's still in its early stage. It's still got warts on it, but we're actually being able to work through what sort of pricing, what sort of market mechanisms, what sort of incentive does that provide to allow farmers to not just think about, can I measure my carbon, can I sell it? More so, can I measure my carbon and can I actually know my baseline and keep it to offset against other emissions that I may have on farm? We also have climate-related financial disclosures. So that is the legislation that applies to the corporates, and they need to report their emissions. Their scope 1 is their direct emissions. Their scope 2 is actually their electricity, so their energy. Their scope 3 is what they get along their supply chain. So for any of the agribusiness corporates, they will actually be looking to farmers to try and get data and measurement to be able to report on their scope 3. They don't need to report on their scope 3 for a couple of years, but there's already a lot of work that the agribusiness corporates, the banks and others are needing to do to try and help farmers get this data. But that is only the next stage. Then we have the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. So emissions, carbon, climate. The next thing is nature-related financial disclosures. The next thing is thinking about nature positive. That means thinking about biodiversity. We have biodiversity credits being introduced, still very early. And of course, we've just had the Nature Repair Act that has come into place. So there are a number of moving parts that make this quite a complex picture, but I think if we can break it down into steps and importantly think, what does this mean for the farmer? That is going to be the way that we need to actually frame this. Thanks, Helen. So the next thing that I am seeing a real focus needs to be on is natural capital. So there's been a work done by Farming for the Future around natural capital accounting. And this is about saying, how do we actually value your environmental assets? How do we value your natural capital and be able to attribute a dollar value so you can put it onto the balance sheet? What are the benefits of doing this? Well, firstly, if it's an asset on your balance sheet, are you going to be able to borrow against it? So we've already got the banks that are saying we're leaning in terms of being able to lend to farmers to invest in sustainability practices on farm. We've heard about green loans. We've got the banks looking to do even more in this space. There are other financing instruments that will come into play. But importantly, if you know what your baseline is, you know what are the things you are doing additionally that can make a difference. Is it actually adding to the biodiversity and the natural capital I've got, or is it taking away from it? So one of the things that I think is a value proposition here is it's the classic, you know, you can't manage what you can't measure. So it's, what do I have now? And what are the things that I can do and want to do? And where do I want to invest to actually make my farm more resilient? Some of the early work that has been done around this in the research has actually shown an increase in productivity and an increase in profitability. So that work's going to continue now across additional industries to be able to see that it is that the same holds true for other sectors. Thanks, Helen. So where to now? Well, there's still a lot of work to go, a lot of conversations to be had. We've got a lot more work to do on sustainability, and that's not just at the government strategic level, but of course at the on-farm level. How do we get that data? How do we get the measurement? How do we get consistency around tools? How do we end up allowing farmers to report? How do we get around some of those privacy issues? You know, for me, I have a real concern about the compliance burden on farmers, particularly the SMEs. So they're already time poor. They're already doing so many things. Are there ways that we can harness data that exists in different areas to be able to then provide that back to a farmer and say, on a permissions basis, can you provide that through? And there's been some work being done with the traceability team through the NLIS system at the moment that's exploring this. Greater collaboration. I talk about Team Australia sometimes, and I particularly see this, you know, when we look at trading markets. Our industry sectors can pick each other off, but it's really important that we give a Team Australia approach, particularly in global markets, and that we're all special. Some may be more special than others, but no one's bad. And I think we've really got to remember that. A lot more investment in research and development. And I think that's where the RDCs can certainly come to the fore. It's a great model we have in terms of that co-funding, but also looking at where there needs to be more research and where they really can be focusing what's coming over the horizon. We do great things in Australia around tech, so innovation will be critical. I think our universities are doing really fantastic things. I do sometimes ask the question, are they joined up? Like, are they collaborating so that we leverage? Because if we can leverage better, then we've got a better use of our resources. The Global Methane Hub, that is an initiative that is doing great work around methane. They've got billions come in from the Bezos Foundation, the Gates Foundation. They've actually done a global scan to say who is doing the research and where are the gaps, and then which country needs to lead that. So we're actually leading quite a bit of the work around genetics and inhibitors in that space. A lot more investment needs to be in adoption and capacity building. You know, it's all very well to do the R&D, but we can't have it just sitting on the shelf. And we can't just rely on the early adopters. We actually need to bring everyone along on this journey. So that co-design process needs to flow through. And then we got to get better at telling our story. You know, I've talked about how we've got to talk and tell our story to not just the converted. And I say this every time I speak to an agriculture converted conference. Everyone in this room is already on the train. How do we get to people who are not? And part of that is we've really got to engage better with consumers. we've really got to make sure that consumers understand the link with farming and the fact that Australian farmers produce safe, healthy, nutritious food and fibre. And it's essential for them. And, you know, sometimes when I hear stories like I heard not long ago, well, actually, there were two stories that came from a kindergarten. One was a little kid who said he didn't want to eat meat because it was bad for the environment. And another kid said, well, I don't want to eat chocolate because it's bad for the orangutans. So, you know, we really need to be thinking about sustainability and how we actually can dispel myths. But at the same time, we've got to make sure that we can demonstrate our sustainable practices. So thanks, Helen. I'll leave it there. I have seen a number of questions come into the chat. So I'll let you manage the questions.
Sure.
And I'll
Sounds
try
great.
and answer them.
Thank you, Sue, so much. It was a really great overview. And so, yes, the first, one of the questions I was going to ask, well, I'll leave it. Rebecca's covered it. I think she said, do you think the discussion and collaboration from the Climate Summit will carry through, even though we've moved on to a new minister? And what do you think were the takeaways from that summit?
Okay, two parts of that. Let me talk about the takeaway from the Climate Summit. I bang on a bit about you can't just do an event like that and then everyone leaves the room and goes back to their own lives and does nothing. So I kept pushing for we need to do follow-up. We need to do follow-up. So that's where the two workshops last week came from. That was sitting down with different people in the room and looking at more consultation. I then met with the Deputy Secretary of DAF and said, how do I take the messages that came from that climate summit, that come from the ag and land sector plan consultation, and weave them into what I'm talking about? And how can I help to continue that consultation process? Because it's really important that we can hear from a whole range of people. And sometimes when government consults, you only get the people who've got the time and the capacity, and sometimes it's through the peaks to be able to provide input. And it's because the rest of us are all time poor. And so for me, it's how do you actually get to the people so you actually find out what their issue is and then be able to say, how do we actually help to address that? On the minister side, look, Murray Watt was a great champion. And I have to say for me, because I had been almost getting a bit rude following COP last year about trying to bring together DQ, which is a climate change department, and DAF, the agricultural department, together. And so for me, that climate summit had both ministers there and a commitment from both portfolios. We've got to keep moving with that. We do have the Nature Positive Summit coming up. And once again, you know, agriculture's involved with that. I'm actually facilitating the agriculture section. We're having a real focus on natural capital. I think we've just got to make sure we keep pushing that. I've been trying to get a meeting with the new minister. I hope I will be able to find time to meet with her. The reality is we're probably going to have an election in the next, 8 months. Will Julie Collins still be the ag minister then? I don't know. It's a difficult challenge, and that's why I am so vocal about how agriculture must be front and centre and must be seen as the solution so that we don't lose a focus on agriculture. And if we get this government returned again, we want to make sure that we don't ever see a return to what we've had previously, where an ag minister ends up being really in the outer cabinet and not part of what's seen as a critical and absolutely vital portfolio. So I think for all of us to keep being noisy about that will be very important.
That's excellent. Thanks, Sue. And then how do we deal with this simplistic reduce the cow herd narrative?
It's, you know, it's interesting because I've had to learn to be a bit less bull at the gate. So, you know, with an adjacent issue, when people first started saying to me, oh, the only way to solve the climate challenge is to stop eating red meat. You know, as a beef cattle farmer myself, I'd sort of arc up a bit. Whereas now I've learned to say, well, look, it really has to be about choice, access, and equity. And I think the same applies to these very blunt instruments about reducing the cow herd. there is going to be a growing need, and we can see it with all of those diagrams coming from the FAO about the growing need for proteins, particularly in those countries in Southeast Asia. They're not going to be able to afford lab-based proteins. And even if they were accessible to them, they're going to be far outpriced. But then, are they really as sustainable as what they can perhaps on the surface claim to be? And I'm really pleased to see that the FAO is now doing some work where they're actually looking at plant-based proteins, lab-based proteins, and then, meat proteins. And they're doing some work which is around the environmental footprint, the nutritional value, and then, production and other factors, which really then allows people to make an informed choice. Now, if a person in the middle of Paris, based on informed choice, still wants to buy a lab-based burger, that's their choice. But the reality is, for most of the world, they're going to need the access to meat proteins, plant-based proteins, and importantly, a balanced, nutritious diet. So I think that's the way we need to frame it, that it's not about something being wrong. I think the wrong thing is the response, which is a blunt instrument. And that's why I think we need to focus on what's the outcome we're trying to get to. And if the outcome is sustainability and better food security, then there's going to be a number of pathways to get there. And look, if there's one thing I've learned from just being on the sustainability journey for the last few years, there's no one single silver bullet. It's got to be a suite of different things that we need to do.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Very good. So Jill's asking, with corporates using the regenerative climate-friendly term more, is this part of greenwashing and watering down the terminology, or is it inevitable during times of change?
So once again, two parts. So it's interesting that the term regen ag used very strongly in WA, used very strongly in the US. I think I'm not so concerned about what the term is. It's what are you actually doing? And for me, all of these different practices, and it's the same as terms around, and we've had them for quite a long time around, the holistic, the biodynamic, and a whole lot of different things. They're all about sustainable practices. And I don't think we should think that they're necessarily at odds. Once again, similar to how I gave the last response, there's no one right answer, but are we getting better sustainable outcomes? And what is fit for purpose for a particular production system or particular environment, or even a particular way a person farms and what they have available to them. So I actually think the good thing is we're seeing more and more people embrace different practices that end up being more sustainable. What we've got to do is make sure that in the end, how does the consumer or even, people along the supply chain, how do they judge this? What measurements are put in place? And part of what the work that is being done by the Department of Climate Change is to develop certain standards around measurement and reporting, which actually will give guidance to how you actually can have that sort of verification, so that there can be credentials that are put in place so that people can know and make that informed choice. I think the other part of that question was around the greenwashing. Interestingly enough, we have one of the most robust corporate regulators in the world. They've already called out a number of the corporates on greenwashing. We also have seen what has happened in certain other countries. The UK has also been pretty robust on greenwashing. I think that it won't just be corporate regulators that will call this out. I think consumers will call this out. And I think the demand will come from consumers that they actually want to see better demonstration of credentials, and what they will want to see is the verification behind that. And that's where it's important that we continue to make sure that there is science and evidence base behind this. One of the challenges to all this is social media, where, a grab on social media can set a whole lot of people off in one way without actually being science and evidence based. And that's where we need to make sure we can call it out where that happens.
Mhm. Good. Rebecca asks, when you talk about ideology rather than science, could you expand on that?
Yeah. So ideology is having a firm view about something that isn't fact-based, that doesn't have the evidence or science behind it. So the example and look, I see this so often in Europe, but even what I was saying before about how the solution to climate change is to stop eating red meat, that is not where the evidence sits, and that is not where the science sits. There are a whole number of different things we need to put in place to meet the climate challenges. And you've got to be careful about, what we classically call the unintended consequences. What are the unintended consequences of the blunt instrument they're using in the EU about reducing the cattle herd by 30 to 50%? Are they going to increase their imports? And what is the environmental footprint of that? And even though that environmental footprint may end up being lower in the EU, it could well be higher in another country, or it could be higher in terms of transport and freight. So we've actually got to think about globally what we're doing. It's one thing to try and reduce our emissions or look at our environmental footprint within our borders, but we've also got to think about globally. And that's where some of those, international commitments like the Paris commitment come in. Ideology also, and even with the kids around saying don't eat chocolate because it's bad for the orangutans, we've really got it. We need to be telling the story better that actually is quite honest about production and honest about the environment and honest about what we're doing and honest about how we care, and be able to make sure we can dispel those myths with the absolute facts. And one of the ways I found I was able to do this was when my first trip overseas, I was in the UK when we were looking at the UK FTA, and I had to front the House of Commons committee where I knew mulesing would come up. And I was asked by a politician, how much lamb are we going to get from mulesed sheep? And my answer was probably none, because we don't mulese our meat sheep. And you could tell from their faces that they didn't know the difference. So I then explained the difference between meat sheep and wool sheep. I then explained a bit of the history about the merino and why we've bred it to have the folds in it. I then explained about our climate and how we get very hot. And I explained about our flies. And I said, it is far better an animal welfare practice to reduce a small piece of skin from the breech of a sheep than to see them die a slow and painful death from fly strike. That was a real lesson for the committee, and they were really appreciative of that. And I actually only found out recently when I was in New Zealand that made a fundamental difference to the UK FTA that we signed. On the other hand, I came back to Australia and I gave our industry sectors a message where I said, I'm not here to tell anyone what to do. I'm only sharing what I'm hearing. But you just need to think about diversification and the fact that markets can shut down overnight. And you may think China doesn't care much about animal welfare. But if the EU says they're only going to pay a premium for non-mules wool, then that's what China's going to be asking us for. And pain relief is just not going to be enough. So just think about that. So I see part of my role is to be a bit provocative, to share what I'm hearing, but also to be able to give the messages that I might be able to give, that government might not be able to give, or others might not be able to give, because this is what I'm hearing and I don't have a constituency that's asking me to give a particular message.
I'll just stop the share. All right. Then we have, I often feel frustrated that the climate conversation focuses on agriculture as the problem and finding solutions for specific problems, rather than taking the bigger picture, agriculture as the solution narrative. Do you have a thought about that?
Look, I'm absolutely with you. I really do think we need to be positioning our narrative around agriculture as being the solution. I think we can talk much more about what we do around sequestration. And in fact, when it comes to carbon, agriculture can actually be brilliant carbon sinks, that we can actually be carbon positive if we go across this. So I think there's more work to do in this area. I'm really keen to look at who has been doing some of the research here, how we can bring that narrative, so that we can actually very clearly articulate that. Something that I'm looking to do at the Nature Positive Summit, because we've got a massive global market there that's coming, but something that I'm keen to weave in. I also think when it comes to natural capital, because we've been doing great things around biodiversity for so long and around soils, that we're well positioned to be leading the world in this. And that's why I'm keen when I'm in the UK to learn what they've done. They've been working on this for quite a long time. But what can we learn from them to position ourselves? And then, look, if we get COP31, I think there's a whole lot of narratives we're going to be able to put in place that leads up to that.
Good. And then what are our internal ag industry cultural issues that you see might be holding us back?
Oh, we don't collaborate. And look, I've never done myself, even though I'm in the red meat sector, I've never done myself any favour with the red meat sector leaders, because I have been critical about how red meat can be one of the worst. Wool can be a bit like this as well, but wool doesn't have numerous different bodies that just disagree with each other, whereas red meat's got so many different peak bodies, and they don't always give this a consistent message, or they bag each other out, and it just does not do our industry any favours. And that's why I bang on about Team Australia, because we've really got to make sure we present that, and when it comes to trade and market access, some of these things get through to our global markets. And, for the live export sector, the closing down of the sector in, what was it, 2011, I was in the middle of that, and I know the minister said, I'm getting different messages from the different peaks walking into the room. So we've really got to make sure that we are thinking about the sector as a whole and thinking how we can work better together and leverage off each other and not be naughty.
Yeah. And then read the adoption and capacity building. There are a lot of farmers within our regen network who are the leaders in this, and they've tried a lot and they've done lots of trials and have results from all their activity, but often get overlooked in favour of university research or industry bodies. How do you think we transition that information? And I guess I just put that in context. We've lost on-farm support and work from departments over the last 15
Yep.
years. So farmers have just taken off and led themselves and done their own trials, but yet they are well ahead of actually what government and universities are now. They've seen a lot of things happening in the paddock. So how do we actually elevate that awareness by farmers and that information that they've got that is being overlooked?
Yeah, look, you're absolutely right. And I always say the private sector is way out ahead in front of governments. I don't actually see the universities as being a capacity building or adoption necessarily. I see them more on the research side. And the thing is, you need RD&E. And I see the regen networks, I see a lot of people who do that work on the ground as being essential for adoption and the capacity building. As you say, a lot of the state governments have pulled out of this space. The RDCs still have a role here, and I've been sending a strong message to government that they do need to invest in this area, because we've got so much that has been done in the area of emissions measurement, carbon measurement, biodiversity measurement, and that's where the focus has been. But there's no point if it's just all going to sit there and we're not having it taken up. And we've got to find a way that it's taken up in the language and the mechanisms that make it practical for farmers to be able to take up. So it can't be in government language, and that's why it's essential that these networks do take this on. As part of the climate summit, Helen, you were there. There are a lot of NRM groups there. I think that they're critical that we can engage, and whatever I can do to help make sure that that message remains strong, I'm happy to do so, because just thinking about that, I will look to put more on that capacity building as being the critical link to farmers, and really the fact that agriculture can be and must be the solution, but it's only going to be the solution if we actually get that adoption.
Well, yes, but also the farmer has to drive the research.
Yep.
We have to actually. So if the farmer can go to the RDCs and say, I'd like to do this research, and there's capacity for them to say, yes, let's do it, rather than the research coming the other way. I think there's a lot of good opportunities there for farmer led, and then if it's farmer led, then it's actually going to be adopted and understood by farmers,
Yep.
which will be very important. So there's an opportunity there. Yes. Next question is, one of the problems with changing to more sustainable agriculture is the lack of support from research and corporates and educators. Example, their lack of emphasis on sustainable ag and agronomist degrees. So within the education itself,
Yeah.
they're not actually supporting the
There's a
sustainable.
real lag. There's a real lag, and the lag is years. And yeah, but some universities doing it. When I was at UNE, they actually were looking at doing some of this, but I think it takes quite a long time. Universities are like great big ocean liners. They take a long time to turn around and respond, whereas you get a lot more nimbleness out of your NRM groups and others. So that's why I think some of that earlier capacity building has to come from. We are getting, I think some of the pathways at university is more through some of the research that they do. And that's certainly what I saw at this Agri-Food Innovation Institute, where there are really some very practical people in there working on this. The real, look, I think that we're going to have to try and look at what are the different ways. I'll be interested when I'm in the UK to see how they're doing it there and what mechanisms they're putting in place. Is it through TAFEs? But also, I know that there's been some capacity building money put aside in the last budget to focus on this. So I think that's something that maybe I can feed back through to the government around how that can be used. And I think the other thing I've been saying to government is don't get the RDCs to do more work around methane. We've got the Global Methane Hub, think about work where they need to be investing in natural capital and how that flows through to capacity building. So we might be able to join the two up.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, and I guess with that whole methane, there's the other view of, well, not the other view, but there's just the natural processes with green growing plants and animals grazing. The methane issue is a non-issue because of the hydroxylene that absorbs and cleans the methane. So when you've actually got grazing animals out in the open on green plants, methane becomes a non-issue. And Walter Yene does some very good work on that. And it's I guess a point of, suddenly we've suddenly accepted the fact that the cattle industry, the methane's our issue, yet people who are planning their grazing and moving animals onto plants that are fully recovered and are green and growing don't actually contribute to the methane issue. So just being that nuance, I think it's about the nuances that are very important for our industry as well. And we have to start talking about the nuances, because there are production methods that are better for the outcomes that we want than others, and we have to start acknowledging those, I think. So another question is, what are some examples of being noisy to the ag minister?
So I will say sometimes you've got to nudge, sometimes you've got to shove. I don't think table thumping is the first way to do things. Occasionally you may have to do it, but it's about influence. And some of the ways I've worked for the NFF, I've worked for, other advocacy groups as well. And, I learned the hard way that you don't always be noisy. Well, not vocally noisy, but it is, who do you need to influence and how do you get that message across? And how do you get it in a way that the minister can own it? So when I say I like to sow the seed, it's get other people to think it's their idea, and then they tell someone else, and then it grows. And I found if you can do that, and look, ministers like to have announceables. So, and they like to own things. That's why they're there in the roles. So it just means that you yourself can't have an ego, because you've got to be allowed, you've got to be able to pass it on. So I found that to be generally the best way to be noisy. And then sometimes you've just got to be, the shoving for me is when I just put things in my slides continuously. So if I want to get a particular message across, which is now what I'm doing around natural capital, and now just from today, do more around capacity building, I do that in every presentation that goes forward, and I get other people then saying it, which means the more people you then get saying it, the more likely it is that someone's going to listen. And it's something that I found in my role has been quite effective. I can amplify messages for agriculture.
Can you clarify your role as special rep? Are you representing government policy, given current tensions between farming policy and farmers?
Well, as I'm not a government representative, I always say I don't speak for the government. Sometimes I get a bit rude when, it happens rarely, but on the odd occasion I might get a message, never gets said to me straight, tell Sue to remove that slide, or tell Sue to not say this. And I say, tell them where to go, because, it is a judgment call. I wouldn't be in this role if I was going to go completely rogue, but I will say at times, this is one I'm going to go rogue in, because I think I need to, and I don't think this is a message government can give, or if it does give, it's not going to come out or be heard in the same way. And when I was first asked if I was interested in the role, it was to be able to really leverage on that opportunity. And it can work both ways. Look, there will be times where it will be a government message I'm given, but I'm only giving it if I really believe in it. So the message around the consultation process on the ag and land sector, I'm happy to champion, because I've worked in reg reform and I'm an absolute champion for co-design, and I'm very critical about regulatory processes that are put in place before you've actually done good consultation. And then I always say, and it doesn't matter how much you do, you can never anticipate everything that's going to happen. So you've got to be prepared to go back and change things or review. So where I actually really believe that it's something that's going to be good for the industry, then yeah, I'm happy to say I'm going to back it. But it is a judgment call. I'm not always going to get it right. And at some stage, if I get it wrong, you won't see me in this role anymore.
Oh no, that's fine. Good. Thank you. I had a couple of questions myself, and one is, all that global impact and perspective. What does it mean to the family farm? Like, what does it mean to mum and dad farmer? And are there opportunities, the options they have in order to, participate? And yeah, how does it look? How does it look for the family farm?
Look, I'm always really conscious about this, and I do say, what's the value proposition? There's a lot of work. Farming for the Future has done the work around showing increase in profitability and productivity. There's a whole lot of other work that will show that if you farm sustainably, it is better in the longer term. In the end, though, you're actually looking at cash flow, because you need the cash flow to be able to farm what's the next thing you're going to do, whether that's, if we're going to go in a dry period, have you got the money to pay for a truckload of hay to feed your livestock? Or, if we're going a really, really dry period, have you got the money to actually buy water in? So it's really important that we actually think about the value proposition, and not just from those early adopters. And the reality is, there's not going to be a premium. Some of the first ones on the train may get a bit of a premium, and they will market their brand around this. But we've actually got to say, well, what's the flip side for this? And the flip side will be, are you going to get discounted? And I think that is something that we may well see come in, which is unfortunate. But, We already see it in the marketplace now. If you're not actually selling the flavour of the month, they say you don't get a premium, but in actual fact, you get discounted because the premium now been baked in. So I think we need to do more. And look, one of the things I've been saying to government, and I've actually just put it into my slides for the Nature Positive Summit as part of the questions I'm going to pose to the panel, is what more do we need to do to actually encourage farmers to be part of this? Do we need to pay them? What are the incentives we need to put in place? Is there something we need to do through the tax system? Are there ways that, you know, we can bring them onto board? I was involved with the introduction of the GST, and we ended up putting money on the table, a huge amount around capacity building, but then there was money to help, you know, pay for software programs and things like that. And I've been quite blunt with government and saying, you need to be thinking about all these things. And so I'm going to be asking those questions on this panel next month to really get the panelists to say, well, what do you think we need to do? Where are the gaps? Yes, we got markets. Yes, we got the banks saying they will lend, but are you going to lend to everyone? Where are the small ones going to find the money for this? I've got a New Zealand panelist, and I'm going to say, well, how did you get the New Zealand farmers to sign up to what I think was quite a high compliance burden around Know Your Number? What did your government do? So I think it's a very live question, Helen, and I think we should not lose sight of it, that just because there's a whole lot of research and there's a whole lot of projects and there's a whole lot of people saying your productivity will increase, in the end it's, yeah, but am I going to get more money in my back pocket, and is that going to be soon? Otherwise I'm not going to do it.
Yep. And also a question, we mentioned the outcome and being outcome focused, and with our monitoring and our ecological outcome verification, we focus on the outcome, not just the practice. And then we adjust the practice and the management decisions in order to get a better outcome. So it's a cyclical continuous improvement process for our ecological monitoring. But I'm interested in the outcome. Do we actually have a shared outcome from the government for Australia on this whole issue? Because, you know, if we don't know which room we're going into, like what that looks like, how do we get there? So it's that notion of, yeah, do we have a clear shared outcome as a nation?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think part of it has come from just the different, I guess, platforms that have been pushing this. I mean, it's why I tend to talk about sustainability, because it's not just climate, it's not just emissions. But in the end, what does that mean? Let me give some thought to that, because I think you're right. But I think if you asked 100 different people, you get 100 different answers.
Yeah, I guess the question is, why do we want it?
And really, I mean, if you were to bring it down, what you want is greater resilience, greater productivity, greater profitability.
Yeah.
And I think resilience is thing.
It captures, yeah. And that's something that came out of the Farming for the Future work, is that increased natural capital and land management improvement actually, you know, linked directly to that resilience.
Yeah.
Now,
just then, you know, I will have to go soon, Helen.
No, we're all, I think that's it. Thank you. Unless anyone's got the last, Sam, did you have a question?
Yeah, look, really interesting talk, Sue. And I got a lot out of you talk around outcomes, verification, evidence, stuff like this. But it seems to me, and I'm sure you've faced this much more than I have, that a lot of it seems to revolve around a narrative that is very suspect. And I do get annoyed that a lot of the science coming out of this is based around a very simplistic model of what's going on in nature and the environment, as in the methane question, as though it's a linear system. And you know, that in the end we can end up chasing their outcomes they desire, but it's really based along a very simplistic model of what's going on in the wider world and the role of farmers have in it as managers of the land. and that the land is also part of the climate cycle. It's not just the atmosphere. So that's the frustration I see, that if we agree their terms of reference, we're going to be bullied into an area that may satisfy their outcomes. It probably won't give a result in the real world, but will have real world impacts, not only at a farming level, individual farm level, but a broader level, climate-wise.
It's a real conundrum, because you actually need to move people far enough to get them to be prepared to back or take on, or be prepared to engage. And some of the more robust and deep science and evidence then follows. And I'm seeing this with the natural capital work at the moment. You know, and that's why I'm trying to encourage RDCs and others to look to fund the next level of research, because we can't base things just on the work done so far. There's enough indicators there that there is something to this. But apart from the very, very wealthy funds, and then you're always suspicious about what they're trying to get out of this, it's hard to get the level of science and evidence around something that's, you know, other than a simplistic model in the early stages. And it is a conundrum, I agree. And I think the thing that we need to do, and it's incumbent upon all of us, is to, where we disagree, make sure we point that out or challenge. And that challenge then is with our own evidence. And look, we saw that around climate more broadly. I'm seeing it now around additives in methane, such as things around asparagopsis and the different research that's coming out about that. And I think the challenge is good, because in the end, that is the challenge that allows you to go to the next level of science and evidence. But in the end, the reality is all research isn't perfect. Everything you think you're going to research doesn't work out to get to where you think it's going to be. And that's part of the learning, and it's what do we learn from it? And that's just the very nature of research. And then the real tricky thing is, how do you get people to fund that research when their risk profile is going to be, yeah, but we want to back something that's going to give us a return. We're not just going to put a whole lot of money into this when it might not work out. So it's a really tricky area.
Yes, and the evidence used can be claimed to be scientific as though it's resolved, when we know that science is really a series of ongoing questions and interrogation of the reality. So the difficulty is they can decide, oh no, we've resolved this issue in a simplistic way, and that can form the basis of the ongoing way of solving it.
And
anyway,
yeah, that's right, Sam. And it goes back to that nuances. It's the nuances around the way in which the connection between the land and the business and the whole, rather than just that seeing everything in isolation. So yes,
and that obviously is where the role of agriculture is so big. If you take a bigger picture of what we're dealing with.
No, very good. No, thanks so very much. Thank you for your time today, and it's been a wonderful presentation and great questions. So thanks, everyone. I look forward to chatting to you maybe about attending the Nature Positive Summit. It would be great to be participating in that. And but otherwise, thank you so much, and all the very best with your ongoing work and representation. So we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
so
you,
much.
Sue. That was great.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
See ya.
Bye. Thanks, Sam.
See you, Helen.
Bye.
That was good.
Yeah.
No.
It's great. Thank you.